We did not sleep long, but we slept very soundly. We didn't even hear someone steal the hay laid on top of the blankets. It was very cold. We snuggled closer together and managed to sleep a little longer, but soon we had to get up. The cold became unbearable. We were both shivering and gritting our teeth. We threw the blankets over our shoulders and began to walk back and forth, hoping to warm up a little. I mentally promised Madonna that if she would let me go home, I would devote the rest of my life to her service. The book I've written is proof that I'm fulfilling that promise. And again the Katyushas began to speak. We tried to press ourselves into the snow. The shells were bursting so close that I had to open my mouth to say a prayer, but the snow piled up in my mouth. One of the shells landed nearby, showering us with snow, and then everything went quiet. We stood up, shook ourselves off, and looked at each other in surprise. When we returned to the place where we had slept, it turned out that all the hay had already been scattered. We had a little more sleep, sitting in some bushes. We woke up about 9 o'clock. It seemed to me that I could no longer bear the cold and was about to go mad. We rose to our feet again, and at that moment we saw an officer approaching. He had a very strange expression on his face. His eyes glistening, he told us that he had a terrible suspicion that he wanted to share. I didn't take him seriously, thinking that the poor guy was having mental problems too. The fact is that a few hours ago we had been approached by a young man with a very similar appearance who asked us whether he was an officer or a common soldier. He complained that someone had put a hoop on his head that had robbed him of his memory. Like many infantrymen, he did not wear stars, but we found his identification card and found out that the man who had lost his memory was a lieutenant. The unfamiliar officer reported in a tragic whisper that he believed the Germans had secretly left and abandoned the Italians. I barely restrained myself from being rude in reply. We were already up anyway and had to move briskly to keep from freezing completely. Therefore, having consulted each other, Bellini and I decided to check this statement just in case, and immediately went to the haystack at the entrance to the ravine, where, as we knew for sure, a section of the Germans was stationed. There, to our horror, we were convinced that the unfamiliar officer was right. There were no Germans. But it is unfair to say that they had gone away, leaving all the Italians behind. A considerable part of our compatriots had gone with them, but we didn't find out about that until several hours later. About 1,550,000 men remained in the ravine, but all, or nearly all, were without arms and ammunition. We didn't need to be fought. We could just be killed.
A wide road was trampled in the snow from the valley to the gully. Sometimes people came along it. When I noticed 2 Germans on the road, I approached them and asked where their comrades had gone. The wounded German cried, and through his tears said that
the village of Arbizov spread out in front of us. It was quiet now. We looked hard into the distance but saw nothing. Only a lonely hut was burning somewhere in the distance.
Bellini and I could think of nothing better to do and decided to wake up the officers and work out some plan.
Soon a group of 7 or 8 officers assembled. It turned out that there was only one senior officer among us, an infantry major, and a very elderly one at that. After a few minutes of socializing, we concluded that the cold and hardship had made a shaky old man into a shaky marasmatic. The only other officer from the 30th Brigade, besides Bellini, was Candela, a doctor in my battalion. Major Wool and many of the officers who were still with us in the evening were nowhere to be seen. The old infantryman refused to believe what we were trying to tell him. He demanded that Bellini and I escort him to division headquarters, where he claimed General X. We agreed, and together we proceeded to the exit of the ravine. When we reached the road, from the direction of the village came to us cries of hurrah, hurrah, a Savoy, and then there was silence. Then the same shouts came from the other side. The Russians were entering Arbuzovs, and some surviving Italian soldiers had decided to do their duty to the end. Perhaps Zorzi was with them? Eventually it also came to the major that we had nowhere to go. There was a German truck on the road. Apparently it had been abandoned quite recently, as the engine was still warm. The soldiers accompanying us immediately went inside to look for food. We kept up. I found a decent slice of bread, about half a loaf, which I shared with Mario. There were also cans of leftover stew. Placing a thick layer of canned meat on a piece of bread, I sank my teeth into the magical sandwich. Delight, seeing the food, the major couldn't think of anything else. He never moved from his seat until he was full. Poor old man. We returned to the ravine, where the other officers were waiting impatiently for us. No one knew what to do. Frightened soldiers began to gather around us. Time passed, and still no decision was made. I took the major aside and told him that we could come out of the ravine. We could take the fight right here or try to make our way southwest. He should think and decide which option was preferable. But the old man could only think about filling his stomach and the cold. Finally, some young captain nervously shouted out, "Enough talk. It's clear enough that we're all going to die, so let's die in battle." After which he looked around and called out, "All those who don't want to die without fighting, follow me." Together with 200 soldiers and sergeants, he took a position at the entrance of the ravine. The other officers began to discuss our prospects. Mario fervently insisted that we form a single column and move to the southeast. The others objected, reasonably believing that this was impossible, since we had not a single compass and besides, we were practically unarmed. Behind us, the junior officers working out a plan of rescue. As if tethered, walked the old major, meek and silent as a sheep. A group of about 100 soldiers also tried not to lose sight of us. The rest, and there were more than 1,000 of them, lay silently on the snow like motionless piles of dark clothes. They no longer had the strength to fight. We moved slowly down the ravine. It turned out to be several kilometers long. Judging by the well-ploughed snow, people had passed through here not so long ago. I thought that we were going straight to the German battery. At the exit from the main valley, this battery suddenly opened fire in the direction of Arbuzov and almost blew us to pieces. It was dark and cold. I couldn't think of anything, only prayed. Eventually the ravine ended. As we came out into the open, we saw many Italian soldiers lying on the side of the road without strength. They could go no further. By pure chance, we came to the road where the main column had passed. Besides, it was very close. Later, we learned that we were separated by only a few kilometers. I felt very sorry for the unfortunate people, lying in the snow and struggling with death from the last strength, not trusting in anything. But despite this, my heart sang and rejoiced, because the appearance of these people meant we are on the right. I guess that's how swimmers feel when they, exhausted from fighting the raging elements, having lost all hope, suddenly find salvation. We picked up our pace. Each of us thought of the men left in the ravine, but no one spoke of them. At last I reminded the major of them, but he did not care to send anyone back. Now from the direction of Arbuzov, I could hear the sounds of a furious battle. Unexpectedly to myself, I stopped and declared to the major that he was simply obliged to send a man back to the village. "I've already sent an officer," he replied languidly, then looked at me closely and, as if he had just recognized me, mutter, "It's you." Then he calmly walked forward without ordering anyone to do anything. I felt that I had to make a decision, but my whole being violently protested against it. Try telling a shipwrecked man that he must throw the wood he's clutching to keep from drowning. That's right, he'd never let go of it, not even for a second. "God help me," I mentally pleaded, made an effort and declared to the major that I would go back. Mario Bellini immediately began to dissuade me, but I reminded my friend that we were officers and this rank obliges a lot, so he decided to come with me. At the last moment, Vincenzo Candela joined us. He decided not to let us go alone. We walked back very quickly, trying to cover the few kilometers separating us from the ravine in the shortest possible time. People were sitting and lying where they had been before. With shouts and, if necessary, kicks, we lifted them to their feet and forced them to line up. We were obliged to get them out of here. Now the only men left in the ravine were those 200 or 300 men who, with the young captain, had decided to die fighting. It was quiet in the direction they had gone. According to my calculations, they were about 400–500 meters away. I said to myself that we can't go and call them. If we spent time on this, the people we had just formed into a column would scatter again, and we would not be able to bring them up a second time. One of the soldiers in our column was riding a half-dead nag that was still on its feet. I explained the task to him and ordered him to get to the young captain and give him the order to follow us. He seemed to obey and turned his horse in the right direction. But a few days later I learned that he had no thought of obeying my order. The soldiers, led by the young captain, were killed. We were very worried that the enemy would cut the road and we would be trapped. But all was well, and we rejoined our main column. There was no limit to my joy. But at the same time, I was filled with confidence that Providence had made me its instrument for the fulfillment of a great mission, to save many people from death. I had snatched 1,000 people out of the clutches of death. I thought, even if I could do nothing else in life, what I'd done was enough. Then I did not yet know that my messenger had not reached the desperate captain and his men. That's how we got out of Death Valley. The village was almost completely destroyed. Most of the buildings were burned or destroyed. Many civilians, women, children, old people were killed by the Germans or later died in the capture of Arbuzov. Behind our backs remained a valley covered with dead bodies. Among them were Germans, Russians, who the Germans had taken prisoner and shot mercilessly, and Italians, who were the most numerous, Italians who died under fire, Italians who fell in a bayonet attack, Italians who died of hunger and cold. But more agonizing than any other was the thought of the many hundreds of wounded who were left to die without any help. I was told that there was a chaplain left in one of our infirmaries. I did not know him and vaguely remember his name. I think his name was Padre Calistillacino. He was from the 51st Artillery Regiment. When I wrote these lines, I did not know that the chaplain was long dead. He had been stabbed by a Bolshevik who burst into the infirmary, while the honest clergyman, almost blind after being wounded, was groping his way between the ranks of the wounded, giving his last blessings. He should not have been allowed to stay, for it was obvious that the Russians would kill him. My guess. I also learned that the wounded who had managed to get to their feet tried to follow the column. They were still waddling, shaving, crawling along for a long time in a last hopeless attempt to save their lives. The road from Arbuzov for several kilometers was littered with the bodies of unfortunate, maimed people who could not move on. Can you imagine this picture, reader? Who knows how they ended their journey? Seni, a junior lieutenant in Torino's 82nd Infantry Regiment, was one of the last to leave the village. He said that he saw with his own eyes how behind the backs of the advancing Russian detachments here and there bright fires flared up, exactly where hundreds of our wounded were lying on straw bedding. It was said that the Germans themselves killed their own wounded, whom for one reason or another they could not or would not take with them. First together with Candela, then alone, I persistently sought out the Italian command. I felt it necessary to report on the state of affairs in our rear, and besides, I confess, in my heart I wanted to be closer to the command, and therefore away from danger, although I swore to the soldiers that under no circumstances the Russians would not overtake us. At the head of the column of Italians was Consul Vianini of the M. Blackshirt Battalion. He reported that our commander is somewhere in the front rows of the column with the Germans. It is impossible to catch up with him. Remembering that night, I think that we were thrown into the ravine with premeditated intentions. We were to play the role of cannon fodder, to delay the advancing enemy and give the main column a chance to break away. We were just lucky that it was coming out of Arbuzov on the road that passed our ravine. I waited for the column to get underway again. I stumbled awkwardly and had just gotten my boots full of snow. I had to take them off and shake them out. At the same time, I wrung out my socks and quickly pulled them back on. While I was performing these simple operations, the frost clung to my feet with such force that I could not stand still. And again I had to jump, stomp my feet, in general to do all the same things I had been doing for many days. How long could this go on? To my right and left, soldiers were also jumping, stomping, clapping their hands, tapping themselves on the shoulders, or engaging in mock scuffles to keep warm. Many jogged back and forth, and that helped, but some stood still, as if made shorter by the weight of the cold. We stood there for a long time, but in the end we went in a huge column. First the Germans. The frost was raging. I had to cover my head and face with a blanket, so I could not see anything around me, only the trampled snow under my feet. As we increased our speed, the blood circulation increased, and it became a little easier. Our helmets were covered with ice crusts. The few horses were dragging the overloaded sleds with strain, and jets of white vapour were noisily escaping from their nostrils. We were walking very fast, and we did not slow down all the way. Under normal conditions, we would not have been able to keep up this speed for more than a few hours. But conditions were too far from normal, and this crossing lasted 2 days and 3 nights. At the crossroads, we saw several bullet-riddled Russian trucks. There were dead bodies lying around them. It turned out that the Russians, feeling completely safe, were bringing weapons and ammunition to their units in Arbuzov. Suddenly they were cut off the road by German tanks. Not a single Russian soldier survived in this massacre. Only 2 Italian drivers, who were wearing Russian uniforms, were saved. Those who were able to talk to them later told that these guys, shortly before the incident, were captured and immediately enlisted in the ranks of the enemy army. Such a fate befell many drivers and other specialists. They were treated well. They were even promised that they would be sent home immediately after the end of the war. The Bolshevik army, for the most part, consisted of completely ignorant people, so it was in dire need of masters. Slowly it was getting light. It was the morning of December 25th. Everywhere, as far as the eye could see, stretched endless white plains. In some places they were cut by dark strips of withered grass. Throughout the march I tried to keep close to Consul Vianini's sled at the head of the Italian column. I tried to keep my eyes on the sled, on the animals pulling it, or on the people walking beside it. The fields surrounding us were so vast that they were overwhelming in their gigantic size. The road went gently upward, and after a while we found ourselves on a small hill. Ahead of me I saw the endless white line of a German column, and behind me stretched the Italian column. It was black in colour and seemed even longer. I couldn't help but think about how many Italians were caught up in these tragic events. Some were already dead. Others were just at these moments dying on the side of the road. Others were still coming. 5 or 6 German tanks were driving sideways, leaving a wide track trail in the snow.
Time passed. We were still moving very fast. A fine, sticky snow began.
We entered a village of poor, thatch-roof shacks. Most of the soldiers had left the column and scattered around the village in search of food. Apparently there was a chicken coop somewhere nearby, because I soon saw several live, fluttering chickens hanging from the shoulders of the starving lads. There was no way to cook the food anyway, but there was no strength to abandon it. There was a woman's colourful apron lying on the snow. It made me think that the Germans who had been here before us had already done something nasty. I also decided to look for something to eat. I took out my pistol and went to the nearest hut, in front of which a skinny, frightened calf was running around. The rooms were empty. Who knows where their occupants had gone? I searched them all, but found only a few raw potatoes. For want of anything better, I put them in my pocket and went out. The wet snow didn't stop. It had been coming for hours. At the end of the village we had to cross a wooden bridge that curved over a wide ice-covered river. Below it, a German truck was burning on the ice, surrounded by burning puddles of gasoline and water. There the Germans had committed a heinous crime. This truck had been hit by partisans. Shooting back, they huddled in the house, but they managed to surround them and take them alive. There were 6 or 7 partisans. The Germans threw them into the burning gasoline. Eyewitnesses said that the living torches for a while ran desperately screaming, then began to tear off their burning clothes and throw themselves into puddles of water, thawed from the flames. There they died in terrible agony. I did not see those corpses. But I saw other naked corpses, also lying on the ice, already covered with a layer of snow. I think they were Russians who had been killed by the Germans not so long ago, I don't know how. In those days we witnessed many manifestations of German barbarity. An Italian soldier who once went with a German into a hut in Arbuzov told me the following. In the house there were only women of all ages and children. They were hiding in a corner in terror. The German chose the prettiest girl, left her in the house, took the others outside and immediately shot all of them, including the children, outside the door. He then returned to the hut, threw the girl on the bed and raped her. Satisfied, he invited the Italian to follow suit, but he refused. The only thing he wanted was a little warmth in the warm house. The German then forced the girl to cook him a meal, after which he put her next to him in bed and forced her to lie next to him all night. He raped her 3 more times. In the morning he took her out into the cold and shot her. How many times have we had to endure in silence the outright brutality of our allies? And the worst was ahead of us. The Germans harnessed the horses from the sleds, loaded with wounded Italians, and put them into their own sleds. Our soldiers could do nothing because they were unarmed. I must note that the Germans did all their outrages absolutely calmly and unperturbed, as if it was their usual everyday work and they had every right to do it. A few words about the Russians. Undoubtedly they were inclined to extremes, and how could they be different if they were under the constant influence of communist ideology, which incited hatred? In general, they were no less murderers than the Germans. Afterwards, we discussed what we had experienced many times, and we agreed on this point. Our rightness is confirmed by the fact that only 20% of Italians who were captured by the Russians managed to survive and return home. The march continued. On the side of the road, there were abandoned Russian tanks. The Germans were taking pictures of each other against their background. I somehow unnoticeably ate 6 or 7 raw potatoes. Not bad at all. An officer walking nearby asked me what I was eating. I gave him the rest of the root vegetables. Consul Vianini found it very amusing the appetite with which we were eating raw potatoes. I must confess that the prejudice which I, like many soldiers, had always felt against the black shirts of the M battalions had completely disappeared after I had seen them in battle. Here and now our generals are nowhere to be seen, while their consul is here all the time and endeavours, to the best of his ability, to maintain order among the Italians.
Halt. I spent several hours hiding from the wind near a large, strange structure, then lying down in the snow, then running and jumping near it.
And back on the road again. To be honest, I was glad we were going again. At every stop, the soggy, icy feet drove me crazy. Better to walk as long as you can and then collapse and die of exhaustion. We walked for hours without stopping. The snow had stopped. The day was drawing towards evening. I walked again with Captain Verena, Carletti, Bona, and San Martino. At another crossroads, we found road signs that gave our souls hope again. As Verinia explained, Miliarovo was no longer far away. It was only 60 or 70 kilometers away, I don't remember exactly. We did not allow the possibility that Miliarovo in the hands of the Russians. Tanks, announcing the neighbourhood with a loud roar, were still moving from the flank. On them sat infantrymen, resembling motionless white owls. Regularly in the mornings and evenings over the column appeared German planes, from which flew on parachutes barrels of fuel and boxes of ammunition. We looked in vain for at least one Italian airplane in the sky. Once upon a time, I think back in school, I heard the words, "I don't know to whom they belong." The wings of our airplanes are the wings of the motherland. This, no doubt, rhetorical phrase seemed surprisingly appropriate and correct in our situation. It got dark. We continued walking without slowing down. Who knows how many exhausted people remained on the road? In total darkness, we passed through a village that seemed extinct. People who hoped that in a few hours they would be safe, cried like children and were not ashamed of their tears. Late at night, the column stopped at one of the villages. The soldiers scattered to their homes in search of food and warmth. Our group of officers also entered one hut. There were people there. The first thing we did was to send a Russian to bring us water. We often gulped snow on the way, but it did not help well, and we were constantly thirsty. Then we asked for something to eat. The Russians silently pointed to sauerkraut in a barrel. I found it absolutely disgusting, and I could hardly bring myself to swallow some of the nasty mess. But the Germans, with the active help of our soldiers, ate it all up. But how warm it was! I sat down by the wall on a pile of empty sacks and relaxed a little. I needed to rest. Next to me was a sack of wheat flour. I began to take a pinch out of it and eat it. The flour stuck to my palate and I had to lick it off with my tongue all the time. The burning lamp created an atmosphere of peace and tranquility. How I wanted to spend the night here. I was well aware of the impossibility of such happiness, but it was surprisingly pleasant even to think about it. The women, dressed in clean, old-fashioned clothes, looked at us in silence. There was more sympathy in their eyes than fear. They realized how much we had suffered. We, in turn, looked at them without malice. By that time we had already learned to distinguish the Russian people from the Bolsheviks, even though they had rallied to defend themselves against the atrocities of the Germans. We had time to feel good feelings for the simple people of small Russian villages where the influence of communism had not reached, and sincerely sympathized with the women who, after the churches were converted into warehouses and stalls, quietly prayed in their homes, hiding sacred icons in secluded places. A German corporal came up to me and very politely, first in German and then in good Italian, asked me to make some room for him. He told his story. As an Austrian, he had spent several months in Italy with distant relatives, where he had learned the language. He offered to share some simple food that he took out of his pocket. He had some Russian breadcrumbs and an Italian galette. We asked the Russian owners of the hut to outline the situation. They explained as best they could that the village was constantly being shelled, by Russian Katyushas during the day and by German tanks at night. Miliarovo is already very close, less than 40 kilometers to it. There are still Germans. This was good news. Having exchanged opinions with other officers, I left the house. It seemed that the column would stay here for some time. Most of the soldiers scattered around the village. Time passed, but no one commanded a general assembly. The moon rose. The icy wind increased. Feeling no longer able to bear the cold, I wandered into a large stable full of people. At first I thought the temperature was bearable, but after a while I had to leave, for the incessant swearing, shouting, and bickering made the stable seem like the anteroom of hell. In all the buildings in the immediate vicinity of the road it was the same. It seemed to me as if an eternity had passed before the column was on the road again. The Germans were first, as before, followed by the Italians. The tanks moved from the flanks. I don't remember that night very well. At first I found that none of my officer friends were around, and I walked for a long time among the soldiers, trying to keep up with the consul's sledge. One thing I vaguely remember is that when we had moved a little away from the village, the Germans found that they were going the wrong way. It is possible that they decided to change direction for some other reasons known only to them. In any case, we stood for a long time on some high ground, open to all winds. The frost became monstrous. From where we stood, we could see countless and quite identical gentle hills and vast plains covered with untouched white snow. A piercing icy wind was blowing, and the cold was increasing. We seemed to be back in the village, or perhaps we had entered some other settlement. I fell asleep on the move. I do not know how long this state lasted, but I was awakened by the protesting cry of a soldier whom I had nearly knocked down. And then I realized that the world around me had changed fabulously. I found myself sitting in the living room of a cozy hotel in the mountains of Switzerland. The walls of the room were beautifully wood-panelled, and crystal chandeliers cast a bright, festive glow. I have never aspired to ostentatious luxury, so I think I was deliriously placed in such exquisite surroundings only because I had not seen anything more fashionable than tents, dugouts, and thatched roof huts for many months. Only the parlour was terribly cold. I called for the servants and sternly inquired why the room was not heated. They immediately turned to the soldiers and replied that they did not know. I became indignant. I built the hotel, so where, I asked, is the well-heated underground room for sleeping? For a while I pondered whether I should go to bed directly on the mirror-glittered floor. If I made such a decision, I would probably become one of the many people who lay down to rest on the snowy road and turned into ice chunks a few hours later. That's what happened to hundreds of people that frosty night. But I decided to leave the hotel and went down the narrow street of a small mountain village to look for the house of the parish priest. I found the house I wanted and went inside, and I was shocked to find not a priest, but an elderly Russian couple and a great many soldiers. But I did not wonder why this was so, because I saw a double bed, on one half of which the soldiers slept. The other was vacant. I immediately declared that this sleeping place had long been prepared for me, put my musket against the wall, took off my boots and socks, stretched myself on the bed, covered myself with a blanket, and fell into sleep. After 3 or 4 hours, I was awakened by a soldier. He shook me insistently by the shoulder and repeated monotonous, "Signor Tenente? Signor Tenente." I woke up and sat up jerkily. What had happened? The column had left hours ago. The news quickly brought me to my senses, and I immediately remembered everything. The stop in the village, my delirium. There were many soldiers in the house. I shouted loudly for everyone to get up and dress immediately. We had to leave quickly. I put on my shoes, threw a blanket over my shoulders. Then, after hesitating, I took a second one, borrowing it from the Russians, and ran out into the street. It was only after a long time that I realized that I had left my musket in the house. It was dark, but the approach of dawn was already felt. We had never been in such a hurry before. Meanwhile, dark figures were emerging from the houses. They were all Italians. A tumultuous stream of people had undoubtedly swept through this village, and its traces were everywhere visible. In a small square I stopped and ordered the bewildered people to line up. It turned out that there were about 200 of us. Then I saw an Italian major appear near one of the huts and head in our direction. He was sitting on a sledge, pulled by his subordinates. The unfortunate man had frostbitten feet. I saluted and introduced myself in full uniform, but the major only waved me away and said that he was resigning his authority because he could not command. I realized that it was vital for us to catch up with the column. In front of us stretched the road on which it had passed. But in what direction? I began to scrutinize the tracks with the utmost care. There could be no mistake. If you go one way, you will come to a safe place, the other way, fall into the hands of the enemy. But unfortunately, the footprints in the snow told me nothing. I was unable to decipher them. The burden of responsibility for hundreds of people's lives weighed heavily on me. I looked at the faces of the soldiers, but I saw their mothers, wives, children, who in a distant country are waiting for them, praying for their return. I cried out to the Madonna, "I pray to you. Enlighten me." In short, I had chosen a direction of travel. But to check myself, I asked 3 or 4 soldiers at random where they thought the column had gone. We all chose the same direction, but we were still not quite sure of the correctness of our decision. Then I resolutely put an end to the hesitation, ordered everyone to fall into line, and went to the head of the column to lead the march. We had gone only a few steps when the marshal and several soldiers came out of the line. The former stopped and shouted loudly that we were going the wrong way, and if we did not return, we would very soon be in the hands of the enemy. I knew that under no circumstances should I show my uncertainty. You'd lose credibility. People will run away and die, so I confidently told the marshal that he can do what he thinks necessary and go in any other direction. The column would go the way we chose. Only one soldier followed the marshal. I still do not know whether these men were sincere in their delusion or whether they were spies working for the enemy. To this question, as to many others, I am not destined to get an answer. There was a moment at the very beginning of the march when I felt that I was going mad. It seemed to me that I was among medieval knights fighting in a tournament, and I had joined their ranks only out of curiosity. By a tremendous effort of will, I pulled myself together, coped with the delirium, and became myself again. I had no more problems with my mind. We were going very fast, maybe even too fast for exhausted people. But we had to catch up with the column at all costs. I never dreamed of a miracle so much as on that cold morning in the snow-covered Russian steppe, staring into the distance until my eyes ached. How fervently I prayed. We were so small and insignificant, ants in the universe. About half an hour later, coming down the gentle hillside, we saw the main column ahead. How much joy there was. We later learned that the column had initially set out in the wrong direction and thus lost 2 hours. It then stopped for a 2-hour halt. We were lucky again. This was the only night when the stragglers had a chance to catch up with the column. Had it happened any other night, we would surely have been cut off. Switching to running, we caught up with the column and mingled with it. A few days later, I learned that the scouts ahead of the column were attacked by partisans that same night. Finding myself in the familiar surroundings, I felt relieved. I passed the trucks with the wounded. They had been standing in the cold for quite a long time, and now the drivers could not start the engines again. There were only a few trucks left. Oh, and these were likely to be abandoned during the day. Indeed, not a single Italian truck made it to Chertkov. When the fuel ran out, the wounded, who were still on their feet, began to waddle after the column. As long as they could, those who could not move, lying in the dead trucks, first cried out loudly for help and then fell silent. I heard there were many suicides. So, after a brief interim episode, the incredible march in the killing cold continued. As I passed the trucks, I saw the soldiers and officers of my battalion. Realizing that the spoils were not for one man but for all, Lieutenant Boner handed me a small pouch that held sugar mixed with ground cocoa beans. After tasting the delicacy, I handed the sack to Bido, a Sardinia-raised artilleryman from the 2nd Battery. On the way, I repeatedly asked for the pouch to be handed to me, and each time I received it immediately. The delicacy seemed marvellously delicious. A little later, Corporal Vanoglio, a driver from the 2nd Battery, joined our group. He said he was one of the 200 men who stayed with the young captain at the entrance to the ravine near Arbuzovsk. You can imagine how I endeavoured to learn from him the smallest details of what had happened. According to him, at first they managed to kill quite a few Russians. But the Red Army soldiers kept arriving, and eventually they wiped out all the Italians. The captain was also killed. During the massacre, Vanoglio himself lost consciousness, and when he woke up, he realized that he was left completely alone. To save his skin, he ran for a long time through seemingly endless fields, then accidentally came to the road and saw the column. During the story, Vanoglio treated me to a cookie, of which he had plenty. I don't know where he got it from. Once again, we were surrounded on all sides by hills with flat, gentle slopes. When we reached the top of another hill, we saw thatched roofs covered with snow in the lowlands. In front of us was a village, probably Kodokovo. The columns stopped. It was getting light. A new day was beginning on December 26. There were Russians in the village. The Germans moved forward tanks with infantrymen sitting on them to clear the road. Beyond the village, the road went up again. Ahead was Sheptuhovka, a larger settlement located on the railroad. So far, we hadn't seen it. I don't remember why, but everyone was sure that the front line was in front of Sheptuhovka. A few more kilometers, and we will definitely break out of the cauldron. We moved forward. The first houses of the village appeared. I was terribly thirsty, so I hurried to drink ice-cold water from the first well on the road. From the bare branches of the trees, ruffled sparrows looked at us. They looked very unhappy. I thought I could feel their frozen bare feet touching my heart. And onward again. A stop longer this time. Here I met Borgai, a technician from the 2nd Battery. We had always been very good to each other. He was walking without boots, in socks, but he didn't get frostbite. He told about some of his misadventures. For example, during the bayonet attack in the Valley of Death, he was so tired that he fell on the snow, unable to move. The Russians who ran by did not touch him, thinking him dead. He was picked up by our soldiers returning to the village. Here an old Russian peasant woman saved his half-frozen feet by massaging them with snow. It was she who advised him to walk onward in socks. The halt seemed to be dragging on. The Italian column was gradually turning into a shapeless crowd because more soldiers were coming up from behind. We snapped our voices, shouting orders to stop and wait until the Germans had completely cleared the passage. Little by little the people moved through the village. On the streets lay dead Russian soldiers. Almost all of them were already barefoot. For their high boots and warm shoes, they quickly found hunters. Little red stars were hidden in the thick fur on the front lapels of their ears. When we passed the village, we walked faster. Now I was walking with Mario Bellini and Vincenzo Candela. We learned that to the left of the village was an abandoned Italian warehouse, leaving Candela on the road, as he was exhausted and unable to walk. We headed towards the warehouse, realizing that it had probably already been looted by the Germans. We arrived just in time to catch one of our soldiers pulling out a bag of galettes. The last one. I stopped the soldier and, threatening him with my gun, confiscated the sack. Leaving him a few dry rations, I distributed the rest to the soldiers, who immediately rushed in unbeknownst to me. I kept some galettes for myself, Candela and Bellini. The long ascent to Sheptukovka began. Antonini came, but Mario Bellini went somewhere. Candela, who was in half forgetfulness, in moments of enlightenment begged me not to leave him. I confidently gave him my word, and to relieve his suffering, tied him to the sled with the wounded. Soon I realized that I could no longer see him. I rushed back, but did not find the unfortunate man. Antonini and I walked along the road, greedily eating galettes. We had already reached the middle of the slope. Suddenly an order came from the German command, ordering us to turn back. Sheptukovka belonged to the Germans. The Italians were ordered to stay in the village we had just left. An unfamiliar lieutenant passed by the column and demanded that we stop and turn back. According to him, it was an order from the general. We obeyed, but Antonini, myself, and a large group of Italians continued to go forward. Are we out of the cauldron or not? Nothing tormented us more than the unknown. We saw that higher up the slope, where the first rows of Germans were entering Sheptuhovka, Russian planes appeared, dropping bombs. Columns of black smoke soared high into the sky. Fortunately, the attacks were not repeated. Before entering the village, we passed a broken German artillery battery. The guns were set up in the snow in such a way as to cover the road with fire, obviously with the purpose of keeping the enemy out. The guns were turned around and turned into scrap metal by Russian fire. I realized that shortly before us a large force of Russians had passed through here, sweeping away everything in their path. When will our torture end? It's better not to ask questions like that, and just keep going. We entered Sheptukovka. Most of the houses were abandoned by their inhabitants and lay in ruins. More or less intact buildings were occupied by the Germans. We walked a bit between the houses looking for a warm corner, but as usual, the Allies wouldn't let us in anywhere. Then we headed for the railroad station. This was the first station since the beginning of the retreat. There we found several dilapidated buildings, evidently formerly used as railroad depots. There were terrible holes in their walls, and the freezing wind was blowing freely through the empty rooms. The Italians had already piled in. They began to burn fires, which did not yet give heat, but enveloped everything around with poisonous smoke. Here we met Candela again. He ate a piece of chicken cooked by one of the soldiers and revived a little. Many were convinced that it was Christmas. I decided not to bother my frozen brain with counting dates and decided to celebrate too. This was the third day I had considered Christmas Day. My Christmas viands this time consisted of a few cookies and canned goods that I traded to a soldier for galettes. I ate all this splendor together with Candela, sitting on two slippery and cold logs. A small fire was burning in front of us, with soldiers huddled around it. The body parts that were close to the fire were getting very hot. The rest remained frozen. It was about noon. I don't remember the next events very well. Everything was shifting in my memory. I think they brought a wounded officer to Candela. He examined the poor fellow but could do nothing to help him. I think the wounded man was unconscious, and I had to use my weapon to make room for him by the fire. I also remember that the noble and very responsible Candela decided to go and see the other wounded men who were laid down here. There were occasional shells exploding at the station. They did not particularly bother us, only reminded us of the need to remain vigilant. After all, the Russians were not far away. Then, for some reason, I found myself with Colonel Matteotti, commander of the 30th Brigade. Antonini was with us. At first we walked slowly through the streets, then the colonel suggested that we go to the station to look for Bellini. The dim winter sun illuminated the village, where people were arriving all the time. We walked along the railroad, then back to the station. By the roadside we noticed a small but very attractive cottage. It housed an Italian sergeant with a large group of soldiers. We sat with them for a while on a neat veranda decorated with pots of all sorts of plants. On the windows hung smart curtains. We admired the coziness, cleanliness, and order. But our friend Bellini was not here. The soldiers treated us to butter, which they had stolen from the Germans. An hour later we went out into the cold again. I can't tell you how heavy my heart was. There was a rumour that we were about to go to Milarovo. It was confirmed, and very soon we moved forward. We had a reason to rejoice. The Germans had more tanks. They were no longer the squat hulks that had accompanied us before, but smaller and more mobile machines. It seems that they were French tanks, war trophies of the Germans. But what does it matter? The promised tank column never showed up, but perhaps at least some of it had arrived. I heard that these tanks also came out of the cauldron in the number of 20 units. It seemed to me that there were fewer. The column began to build near the railroad. The sun was setting. Time was passing, and we were still standing in the snow. On the one hand, this was good, because our compatriots who, obeying orders, had returned to another village, could catch up with us and join the main column. But on the other hand, things were worse than ever, because the murderous cold was reducing our chances of survival by the minute. The worst night we were to spend on Russian soil was coming. Standing motionless in the snow for hours on end was impossible, so we tried to move. I went to the well and drank some water. Then I listened for a while to Colonel Matteotti's heartfelt speech. It was not addressed to anyone in particular, but to all who heard him at that moment. It seemed to me that our colonel, feeling the need to explain to his subordinates what was happening and sincerely wishing them well, had lost his sense of reality. He made a sentimental monologue about the sense of duty and love for the country. His words were so untimely and inappropriate that the listeners gradually dispersed. I went back to the storehouse and warmed myself a little by the fire. The soldiers, coming constantly from the distant village, complained that they had to run for several kilometers under the fire of the Russians. The unarmed Italians suffered heavy losses. The Russians tried to cut them off from the main column and destroy them. This was told to me later by Captain Pontoriero, who was there. Personally, I only heard the shots of Russian mortars. I left Sheptarkovka with Bellini, Antonini, Verena, Bona, Candela, and a large group of soldiers from the 30th Brigade, but very soon found myself alone with Candela. He was leaning on my arm because he felt very weak. His handsome, intelligent face looked pale and haggard. I, on the other hand, was in great shape. Perhaps it was a kind of nervous reaction, or perhaps it was the fact that I had eaten and slept a little. It was quite dark. We were walking pretty fast. The dark sky above our heads became surprisingly clear. The temperature continued to drop steadily. We didn't even know there were such bitter frosts. A cold wind was blowing from the right side. It gradually gained strength and soon, in gusts, began to shower us from head to toe with cold snow powder. Ice masks froze on our faces. The torsos on the right were covered with a thick frozen crust. The frost was so strong and the wind so penetrating that people felt as if they were walking through the snow naked. Every cell of their skin struggled to resist the cold. The line gradually broke up, and the width of the column decreased. Driven by the frost, the men were forced to increase their steps all the time. The wounded and frostbitten were left behind. I gave the blanket I had borrowed from the Russian hut to Candela to wrap around his shoulders and head, and I threw the blanket over her head too. The knitted helmet was not the best protection for her, so we temporarily stopped seeing what was going on around us, seeing only a small piece of road under our feet. So we walked on, supporting each other, trying not to think about the cold, but only to go, go, go. Soon Candela began to groan. He was dragging his legs with apparent difficulty. "Come on, boy, don't give up. Go!" We passed a long line of Italian trucks. They'd obviously been abandoned a few days ago. They looked like they were made of glass. God help whoever dares to touch that glass with his hand. Right in front of us, the moon was slowly rising. It was rising quietly from behind the majestic white hills. It was a very large and ruddy moon, but we couldn't think about the moon or anything else. We had to get going. The march gradually turned into a run. Candela begged me to go slower. I tried to keep him on the left side of the column, so that those on the right would cover my friend from the wind that might kill the unfortunate man. There were more and more people lying down in the snow. There was nothing to think of stopping and trying to rouse them, to order them to go forward. To stop meant imminent death. One had to move to survive. No wonder people were losing their minds, becoming delusional, seeing things that were not real. Some people felt like they were entering their homes. They reached out to hug their wives and children, went to the bar in the corner for a warming drink. From all sides came meaningless remarks, incoherent exclamations. One soldier kept muttering the same words monotonous. A little soup, a little warmth. A little soup, a little warmth. I was feeling great, perhaps even militantly cheerful. I almost wished this march would never end. I was overwhelmed with the desire to go forward. I could clearly feel the warmth spreading through my body. The wind only spurred my legs, and I could barely keep from running. A native of Palermo, Candela wasn't used to sub-zero temperatures, which is why he felt so bad. Suddenly I felt the urge to relieve myself. Even in such conditions, the natural needs of the human body should not have been forgotten. I was not afraid to stop, for I felt strong enough to make a good dash afterward and catch up with the column. But I could not leave Candela unaided. If he fell behind, he would never catch up with the Germans, and that meant certain death. So I decided to entrust him to one of the soldiers. Eventually I found a soldier who seemed to me to be an obliging man and agreed to take care of Candle for a while. I made sure that the soldier remembered my friend's name, for I was very much afraid that when I called him, Candela himself would not respond. Relieved, I made the unforgivable mistake of washing my hands with snow, and instantly I could no longer feel them. I started rubbing them fiercely, clapping my hands, but there was no effect. The hands didn't exist. So I pulled on my worn-out gloves, shoved my hands deep into my pockets, and ran forward, remembering to pray fervently. "Lord, don't let me lose my hands, Lord. Help me." Pretty soon I felt that my hands were coming back to life. Encouraged, I walked briskly along the column, calling out my friend's name from time to time. My voice is quite loud, and in the silence of the night I couldn't complain about the audibility, but still there was no answer. I paced back and forth, yelling the same name so loudly for so long that I might have sounded crazy. When I had completely lost hope, I suddenly heard Candela's quiet voice. I took him by the hand again, and we walked on. But he was obviously feeling worse and worse by the minute. Suddenly he trembled and began to whisper frantically, "My heart, in my heart." From the fragmentary phrases I realized that he could see his hospital on the down and was about to enter it. I had to slow down a bit. It was not to be forgotten that Candela had 2 children left at home. I made another futile attempt to find a place for him on the sled. To top it all off, Candela lost his glasses. Quite unexpectedly, I managed to get him on a horse behind another wounded man. The horse, slowly shuffling its feet, moved forward. I walked beside him, keeping on the left side of the animal, so that it shielded me from the incessant wind. Suddenly it occurred to me that the horse was suffering from the cold as much as we were. Its right side was also covered with a crust of ice. Not only people suffer and die in war, but also animals drawn into it by the will of men. After a while, Candela wanted to get off his horse. For a short distance he walked quite briskly, but then again he felt insurmountable weakness. I was again helped by chance. I saw a horse without a rider. The wounded men it was carrying had recently dismounted to continue on foot. Sitting motionless on a horse freezes you very quickly. I noticed that Candela had lost his gloves somewhere, so I gave him mine. Candela was out of breath. It seemed to me that he had fallen out of reality. He was capricious and did not want to ride the horse. I scolded him like a child and threatened him with punishment. He obediently quieted down. To think that only 2 days ago this man had deliberately risked his life by returning with me and Mario Bellini to Arbizov to save people. All night long, I had been guarding my friend, making sure that he travelled on foot or on horseback. The bright moon illuminated the road and the vast steppe around. After a few hours, the huts appeared on the right side of the road. I heard a lonely voice calling again and again for some sergeant I did not know. In the same way I had not long ago been running along the column and shouting the name of a friend. There was a rumour that we had come out of the terrible cauldron and were in German-occupied territory. Milerovo was already close. I decided to stop together with Candela in the first hut I found on the way, although I did not want to stop. I was full of desire to go on. The hut was packed so tightly that it was impossible to enter, but there was a squat stable close by, and I tried to find a place there. It took a great deal of effort to drag Candela into the room. He was unconcerned and stood silently with his head down, unresponsive to the noise made by the soldiers. I saw that there was a cow in the stable with us and ordered her to be driven outside to make room. No one paid any attention to my threatening order. The room was so crowded that it looked as if it were about to collapse. Fearing that the flimsy walls would not be able to withstand the pressure from inside, I grabbed the cow by the horns, turned it toward the door, and kicked it hard in the arse with my shoe. But then a couple of Russians appeared next to the cow and started pushing it back in, crying. I yelled that I would shoot them and the cow. Only then they disappeared. I pushed the animal out into the street, and we settled down in its place. The first thing I did was sit Candela down on a low bench in the corner. He kept muttering some nonsense. For instance, he told me that the room we were in was for soldiers, and that his hole, which was well heated, was prepared for us officers. I spread a blanket directly on fresh cow cakes, and we lay down. Candela placidly declared that everything was all right now and fell asleep. I slept a little too, though the soldiers were always bickering and making a terrible noise, and there was a constant banging at the door for a place to sleep. It was quite cold in the stable, but I did not like the soldiers' attempts to light a fire. A fire could break out instantly, so I decided to move on. Candela seemed to have recovered a bit and came to his senses. We went out into the night. There were soldiers stretching along the road. They were the thinning remnants of the column, and Candela immediately became weak again. I found a horse, put my friend on it, and forbade him to dismount. We rode through the white desert. A stubby soldier led the horse by the reins. The poor animal could hardly move its legs and kept trying to stop. The soldier had to keep pushing the horse with a large stick. Several times I myself demanded that the soldier should properly knock the weak nag, which persistently did not want to go, at the same time shuddering at the thought that the horse was also hurt. And so we went forward, leaving kilometre after kilometre behind us. Now Candela claimed that there were tall, beautiful houses along the road, and whimpered to be allowed to enter one of them. And every time after my stern shout he would shut up resentfully. In the darkness we saw a truck coming towards us. It stopped in front of us. The Germans got out of it and started fiddling in the snow. I asked how many kilometres were left to Milerov. It turned out to be only 2, thank God. I had been suffering from constant pain in my legs for some time. My bare heels could hardly bear contact with the cold and hard as iron inner surface of my boots. To the left, a structure of very impressive size could be seen. It was a sewage treatment plant. At last lights appeared in the distance. A settlement? I had no choice but to go to the first house that had a light in its windows. Candela was dying. His handsome face, covered with an icy mask, was frozen in a horrible grimace. I knocked at the door. An unfamiliar Italian looked out of the house. A fire was burning in the small log hayloft, filling the room with a marvellously stinking smoke. Italian soldiers were sitting there. I settled Candela beside them on the floor. The main part of the house was occupied by the Germans. I knocked, waited for someone to open the door and enters. 2 rooms were filled with people sitting and lying in a variety of positions. I politely explained that I was an officer and was accompanying another officer who was dying. Then I asked them to shelter my friend for a while. In the meantime, I would find some shelter for him. I was not refused. I brought Candela in and seated him on the only vacant seat by the door. Then I decided to sit with him for a while, to calm him down and see how he felt. The house was quiet, only the heavy breathing of those sleeping could be heard. For some reason it was soothing. A big Mongol who had also served in the German army turned his round yellow face and stared at us silently. He chewed relentlessly, taking something out of his pocket and putting it into his mouth without looking at it. Candela soon dozed off, and I went to look for a place to sleep, and at the same time for the headquarters. It was getting light. More and more soldiers were entering the settlement. It turned out that it was not Milerovo, but Chertkovo. Soon its siege was to begin. How many of us made it to Chertkovo? According to our calculations, it turned out that out of 30,000 people who took part in the battles on the Don, no more than 8,000 came to Chertkovo. The rest were killed, died, or, which was often even worse, were captured by the enemy, and the captured probably outnumbered the dead. The night was terrible. Guidici, a junior lieutenant in Torino's 82nd Infantry Regiment, who entered Chertkovo a few hours later than I did, said that the road was literally blackened with dead bodies. Exhausted men were falling on the snow, never to rise again. Some were going crazy and didn't realize they were dying. The most stubborn crawled along the road for a long time until their strength finally left them. Most often I heard of cases of insanity. I remember how I was shocked by the story of a man who suddenly began to laugh, sat down in a snowdrift, took off his shoes, and began to bury his bare feet in the snow. After laughing, he loudly sang something very cheerful. There were many similar cases. I walked for a long time through a small provincial town, looking for the headquarters. After a while I got out on the main street. Here I met an Italian patrolman who gave me all the news. It was nice to see that the soldier was neatly dressed and well armed. According to him, there were about 500 Italians and the same number of Germans stationed in Chertkov. On 3 sides the Russians came up, but not many. The road to the west is still clear, so there is a chance to break out. In the town there are food and uniform depots, and an operational headquarters. I immediately headed towards the headquarters, but very soon I was forced to walk slower. My legs ached mercilessly. Near the hut I noticed the corpse of a German soldier with a broken head. Apparently, the partisans had also been in the town. I passed our trucks, abandoned on the road quite a long time ago. Among them were several vehicles with red crosses. Looking at them, I remembered the first days of the retreat, when these trucks stretched along the roads in an endless line, loaded to the brim with people. Later I learned that the same thing was happening in Chertkov. A group of Russian tanks broke through the defences and came close to the town, forcing the rear services to flee in haste. We were still fighting and did not think about retreat, and far behind our backs were already moving columns of trucks and soldiers on foot, gripped by indescribable panic. People tried by any means to find a place on the car, and when it did not work, lay down on the tarpaulin top, trying to squeeze into it with their whole body. If there was no more strength to hold on, they rolled to the ground and often immediately found themselves under the wheels of the following car. Soldiers tried to stop passing cars by blocking the road and were often killed. Drivers did not stop, realizing that even the slightest increase in load would not move the overloaded vehicle. A 20-year-old driver from Como recounted that once, as he ran over 2 or 3 soldiers blocking the car's path. A severed hand fell on his windshield. I went around the snow-covered mounds of obscure purpose and came to a straight street where the headquarters and various services were located. I exchanged my worn, dirty and torn blanket for a new one. The soldier who issued me this marvellous item retrieved it from a large pile thrown right at the curb. "Excuse me, Signor Tenente," he said hesitatingly. "Will you take the blanket yourself, or will you send your orderly for it?" I eyed the soldier suspiciously for a few moments, sensing a sneer in his words. But I soon realized that he was absolutely serious and had no intention of laughing. Perhaps he even empathized with me and wanted to show me that I had come to a place where people understood the meaning of discipline and order. "Yes, of course." I answered reluctantly, "I guess I'll send an orderly." but the blanket was so delightfully soft and pleasant to the touch, especially compared to my dirty rag, that I couldn't bring myself to part with it. "All right, though," I added. "Let me have it myself." Eventually, I found the building that housed the headquarters. Entering, I went straight to the kitchen. Two cooks, without further ado, put before me cognac, hot meat, galettes, and marmalade. Immediately other soldiers entered the room, among them Bellini and Antonini. With what greediness we devoured the food. After swallowing my portion of brandy, I told my friends that I had left Candela with the Germans in a house at the very edge of the village, that we must find a place for him and bring him here as soon as possible. Did we send anyone for him? I don't remember. But I do remember suddenly feeling overwhelming nausea and vomiting. Then I moved the stool closer to the stove, took off my shoes, stretched my legs closer to the fire, put my elbows on my knees, put my head down, put my face in my hands, and fell asleep instantly. I woke up an hour later. "Candela!" I jumped to my feet. As I pulled on my boots, I thought I had made a fool of myself by subjecting my feet to such intense heat after such a long period of hypothermia. If they were even a little frostbitten, they would be beyond saving. As it was, they were sore for many more days. The soldiers from the headquarters escorted us to a one-story building next door. There was only one large room, where two long rows of hastily made wooden beds with coarse cloth bunks stood. This was probably where the staffers slept. The room was cold, and we had to light a fire. Bellini and Antonini each took a bed. Personally, I didn't like the place, so I went out. Together with a sergeant from the Chekhov garrison, who had volunteered to be my guide, I went into some houses on the opposite side of the street. In one of them, squat but rather pleasant-looking, I saw a room where there were benches with bunks and a small iron bed. A few soldiers were just finishing cleaning. I decided to settle down in this place that caught my eye, took a bed and one of the benches for myself and Candela, and set out in search of him. Unexpectedly, I came across him as soon as I stepped outside. He was walking slowly down the road, illuminated by the dim morning sun. His face was no longer covered by an icy mask. He was walking hunched over and sobbing because he thought I had abandoned him. I dragged him indoors and began to make excuses. Candela told me the following. When he awoke, he found himself surrounded by cackling Germans who were hurling insults at him. Then a soldier came into the house who took him outside and led him to headquarters. But I never remembered whether we had sent someone for Candela or not. Soviet soldiers fired up the stove, and the room gradually began to fill with blissful warmth. I brought Candela something to eat, laid him on a mat, covered him with 2 blankets, and only then stretched myself on the bed. That day we only ate and slept. It is impossible to express the feeling of animal satisfaction that embraces a man who sleeps in warmth, especially if he has been deprived of such an opportunity for a long time, and how pleasant it is to feel a blanket on one's body, keeping one warm. You can even turn around, take a deep breath and fall back into sleep. And you don't have to remember every second that in a second you may have to jump on your feet and run somewhere, or maybe even accept death. It's so nice to relax completely, stretch out on the bed and rest in peace. Those blessed hours are long gone, but I will never forget to my grave the indescribable feeling I experienced then. Life began anew. Whenever I woke up, I ate something and thanked the Lord for sending me those blessed moments. And then I went back to sleep. Gradually the rooms were filled with soldiers and officers. By evening only the smallest room was left free, where all kinds of garbage was piled up. Thus we lived the day of December 27. Night came. The fire in the stove went out, and it became much cooler. By morning the room was very cold. The fire was rekindled, and the room began to fill again with gracious warmth along with the acrid smoke. We spent the second day in the same manner as the first, eating and sleeping. Our main food was galettes and canned sardines. We extracted the tasty fish from colourful jars with inscriptions in all sorts of languages, along the winding roads of World War II. They had travelled here from the farthest corners of the planet. We could feel life slowly returning to our exhausted bodies. On the third day of our stay in Chertkov, there was heavy shelling at night. Artillery, katyushas, mortars. The damned Russians were reminding us that they were not far away and would soon move on us. Several mines penetrated the roof of the headquarters building and exploded inside. Lieutenant Colonel Virginio Manari, commander of the Tchaikovsky garrison, was seriously wounded and died a few hours later. What awaited us ahead? It was said that the Germans had been given a 4-day rest, at the end of which we would be on the road again. I would ask myself the question, what would have become of us without the Germans? It is a matter of great regret that I have to admit that if the Italians had been alone, all of them, without exception, would have been in the hands of the enemy. I hated the Germans for their cruelty and the defiant arrogance with which they treated people of every other nationality. I did not understand why they were sure of their right to exploit all peoples without exception, and why the exploited should be grateful to their oppressors. But nevertheless, I thanked God that we were in the column with them, and prayed that in battle they would be victorious. Despite my dislike of the Germans, I cannot help but confess that, as soldiers, they have no equal. Whatever my purely human attitude toward these men, I bow before their military skill. In those days in Chertkov, I often watched with excitement how the German soldiers, at a strictly established time themselves, without orders from the commander, build up and in small groups went to the front line to replace their comrades. However, later, after talking to soldiers who also had to leave the encirclement in other parts of the front, I changed my opinion, and now I do not think that the absence of the Germans would mean certain death for us, maybe even on the contrary. In this connection, it is worth mentioning the odyssey of the Alpine Division, which from the very beginning proved that it was superior to the Germans in everything, and in the end they entrusted themselves to the division. Besides, I now assume that if Pasubio and Torino, as well as Forcesca, had acted on their own, they would have come out of the cauldron faster and with fewer losses. If we hadn't gotten so far south, it would have taken less than a week's march, and we would have been free. We would have been able to sleep in warm houses, we would not have been constantly shelled by the Russians, we would not have been subjected to such total and senseless destruction. My dislike for the Germans, whose attitude only increased our disorganization, was much stronger. We were at Chertkov, awaiting further instructions. The town was divided by a railroad into two roughly equal parts. One belonged to the Ukraine, the other to the Cossacks. In general, this settlement was no different from most small Russian industrial towns. Long rows of huts with dark walls and thatched roofs. Occasionally there were huts covered with metal sheets. Brick houses were extremely rare. There were also a few stone too, and three-story buildings, industrial warehouses, and a few tall and quite modern structures made of reinforced concrete that had been disfigured by the war. The city was situated on hilly terrain, so some of its neighbourhoods rose above the surrounding plain. Huddled together in low places, the shabby huts were covered with snow, and all around stretched snowy expanses without end and without edge. The Italians were quartered in the areas lying northeast of the railroad. In the southwestern neighbourhoods lived the Germans. The houses there were bigger and better than ours. The Italian food and industrial stores were in the hands of the Germans. Our services engaged in supplying food to the troops abandoned them when the first Russian tanks appeared in the city. The Germans defending the city considered the warehouses their war booty. Only on the very first day, Italian soldiers managed to get some food. On the second day, the Germans put armed sentries at the warehouses. Thanks to the efforts of our senior officers in the city, began to operate two food distribution points. But the portions were very small. Only those who managed to snatch something from the warehouses in time had a normal diet, but several thousand people lived on starvation. By that time, all the houses were filled with wounded and frostbitten people who could not move, and therefore could not walk to get food on their own. Therefore, whoever was sent to look for food had to stand in endless lines for hours and still did not get enough food. I think that in Chertkov there were also quite a few people who died of starvation. As a result, soldiers began to steal, often with the connivance of their officers. The Germans opened fire on them without remorse. It was a great shame to part with one's life in such a way. In the city there remained warehouses destroyed by Russian shells. There you could find mountains of pasta mixed with stone fragments, dirty ice and snow. I saw it with my own eyes. It was said that somewhere in the snow near the warehouses lay the corpses of 60 or 70 of our soldiers. On the first day of their stay in Chertkovo, they found cognac in the warehouse, had some too much and went out for some air. They froze to death just a few meters from the door of the crowded room, and no one remembered them. When I got to Chertkovo, I did not go anywhere for the first 2 days, only ate, slept, and occasionally visited the nearby headquarters to learn the news. Therefore, I know about most of the events of those days only by stories and rumours. On the third day, it was already December 29. I managed to overcome my selfishness and laziness and decided to take a little trip around the city. It was time to assess the state of affairs with my own eyes. With considerable difficulty, I stuffed my sore feet into my boots and went out into the cold. The house where I was best stood on a wide, straight road, the local avenue. On all sides in the snow I could see black craters, traces of mortar fire. In a small square remained charred Russian tanks. It is possible that it was they who once caused panic among the rear guards and turned them into flight. Beyond the square the avenue became narrower and now ran between two rows of squat huts. In front of one of these I saw a heart-rending picture. Two men were squirming on a snow-covered heap of garbage. One, noticing that I was looking in his direction, shouted desperate, "Signor Tenente, please don't leave me, Signor Tenente." I approached. The unfortunate man's legs were terribly scarred by mine splinters. He said he had been in that position for hours, but no one wanted to help him. A second soldier, probably wounded by the same mine, lay unconscious. His face was covered with blood. His eyes were closed, and his body was twitching incessantly as if he were convulsing. He was breathing heavily, making a strange puffing sound. People were walking by, as if they didn't realize that the two of them were in need of urgent help. Probably no one cared about other people's suffering, and nobody paid attention to the unfortunate people. The two maimed men were alone in the crowd. I assured the wounded man that I would not abandon him and asked if there was anyone in the neighboring house. The wounded man replied that it was full of people, sighed heavily, and lowered his eyes. Those who live in warmth don't care about others. He looked at me fearfully, as if afraid that I, too, would leave them to die in the snow. I rushed into the house, the door to which was 3 or 4 meters from the freezing wounded. A cheerful galloping was heard in the first room. About a dozen Italian soldiers were crowding around a business-like southerner engaged in cooking pasta. They greeted me in a friendly manner and even offered me a taste of the hot dish. Without saying a word, I went out. The fact was that a little earlier I had noticed a major on the road heading in our direction. When he approached the house, I explained what the matter was. The major had demoralized his subordinates and ordered them to take the wounded to the infirmary. I myself refrained from making a showdown with these unfamiliar soldiers, as I was not sure of a favorable outcome. I was afraid to give vent to the rage that was choking me. Now we had an opportunity to do something for each other, and it was a sin to neglect it. I personally saw to it that the wounded were brought safely to the infirmary next to the headquarters. One who was less seriously wounded was laid on a window grate and carried. The severely wounded one was loaded on a wheelbarrow. Just in case, I decided to escort the procession to the infirmary, but it appeared that the soldiers realized their guilt and repented of their criminal indifference, so my presence was not necessary. Before leaving, I approached the wounded man lying on the wheelbarrow, a stout, stocky southerner. He took me by the hand and did not let go for a long time, trying to say something, but he could not utter a word and only puffed loudly. When the company was a few steps away from the infirmary, I left them behind and headed toward the warehouses. As I passed a small wooden shack, I heard a voice. Someone was shouting, "Signor Tenente." I had to go in. Inside was an unfamiliar soldier. He was sitting upright on the floor with his knees drawn up to his chest. A blanket was thrown over his shoulders. His boots were next to him. Without hiding his tears, he told me another heartbreaking story. His comrades had brought him here, taken away his gloves, and left him. His feet were frostbitten. I also noticed that the soldier had black spots on his nose and cheeks, a sign of the beginning of gangrene. I assured the crying young man that I would certainly help him, and went off to find some transportation. Just at that time 2 Germans were walking across the square where the tanks were standing. One of them was pulling a small sled behind him. Not having the slightest hope that they would listen to me, I nevertheless approached them and asked them to lend me the skids for a while. To my great surprise, the German immediately agreed and even helped me to put the frostbitten man in them. Then we dragged the skids together. I wanted to put the injured man in the house near which I had found the 2 wounded men shortly before. I knew that the infirmary was full, and there was still room in that house as far as I could see. The German diligently helped all the way. Sometimes he even drove me himself, pointing at the fainted man and repeating "Kaputt, kaputt." He helped me carry the soldier into the house. I decided that the man was an Austrian conscripted by the Germans. A typical German would never behave like that. That's what I thought there and then. In those days I was absolutely convinced that Germans were incapable of human feelings. Only now I understand that they too have churches, mothers, children, poets. But in that distant 42, looking at the behaviour of Germans, it was hard for me to imagine it. There were 3 heated rooms in the small house. 2 were occupied. In the third, I found only a soldier stretched out on a blanket. I thought he was dead. But when I wanted to pull the blanket out from under the corpse, he moved slightly and let out a faint he was still alive, maybe even aware of what was going on around him, I muttered. Who would have thought? And left the guy alone. I didn't talk to him or try to comfort him in his last moments. The selfish feelings that I'd recently had such a hard time getting rid of came over me again. I decided that I had to take care of myself first. So I would not even go to the warehouse, but would hurry back to my little house and lie down to rest. After all, my legs are also very sore. Who knows how much suffering can be seen on the streets and in the houses of Chertkov? It is not possible to help everyone. I decided not to waste any more energy helping others, because by doing so I reduce my own chances of survival. All noble feelings quickly left my soul. It lost sensitivity, turned to stone. Although, to be completely honest, at that moment I was not too concerned about my fate. Worry is too complex a feeling. It requires a great deal of effort and expense. I was overcome by a dull indifference. Little by little we all became insignificant beings, devoid of thoughts and feelings other than the animal instinct of self-preservation. That morning we witnessed the German bombardment of Russian positions around the city. The roar of the sirens gave us much pleasure, and the terrible rumble of the explosions caused joyful laughter. That day we finally saw our native, Italian airplanes. They were twin-engine Fiat Bar-20s that flew low as if to greet us. We greeted our machines with enthusiastic shouts. From then on, almost every day, unless there was low cloud cover, German airplanes flew over the city. Italian ones also appeared quite often. Since they always flew low, the Russians, seeing them, often opened fire with rifles and machine guns. When will we go to our own? And how far away are they now? We had no information. Only the Germans had radio communication. They shared with us whatever news they wanted or thought necessary. That evening I saw Colonel Matteotti. He was lying on a straw bale in the same row with the other wounded and frostbitten officers. I noticed that his feet and hands were covered with ugly red blisters. At first he mistook me for Bellini, but then he recognized me. When he spoke, I put in to any occasion. Yes, sir, and no, sir. To let him know that, whatever case, he was our commander. Matteotti confessed that he could go no farther, so he had lost all hope. I tried in vain to console the weary man, to strengthen his spirit. In the end I left. I happened to meet him again many years later in Italy. It turned out that the next day a German airplane landed in Chertkov, which took wounded Germans and 14 wounded Italians. Matteotti was among them. At headquarters I learned the news. The German and Italian Alpine divisions were on their way to Chertkovo. No one knew whether the town was surrounded or whether the road to the west was still free. The news spread rather quickly and instilled in our hearts an almost faded hope. The third day of our stay in this Russian town came to an end. In the evening we prayed for a long time, and the unbelievers joined us. I think it was not only fear that guided them. In those days, when we were in Chertkov, the supernatural was so close to the natural that it was senseless to deny the existence of a higher power. You wouldn't deny the existence of material things that are before your eyes. Snow in the street, fire in the stove. A dim light illuminated our grey, emaciated figures from the low ceiling. A piece of telephone cable burned slowly in a neat little torch that barely dispersed the darkness, but drew the gaze of several dozen admiring eyes. From time to time the sound of machine gun bursts came from the street. It was the morning of the 4th day of our stay in Chertkov. This day, like all the previous ones, we began with a rich breakfast. We had enough food, which at different times had been stolen from the warehouses. We managed to get something at the food distribution points, so we were not poor. But nevertheless we all wanted to make up our minds. We could not help worrying, feeling that the enemy was getting closer and closer. A little more, and the ring will close. What will happen to us then? That day, General X received orders to prepare to leave the city. General X was the commander of all combat and non-combat Italian units in Chertkov. He fulfilled his commanding functions by occasionally gathering the senior officers of each regiment at his home. Other generals who were in town at the time were also invited there. There were no more than 2 of them left. The rest, wounded or frostbitten, were taken out of Chertkov by airplane. In addition, the headquarters was officially renamed Comando delle Truppe Italia in Linea, Battista and was now in command of all Italian troops, together with the Germans participating in the defence of the city. The troops under his command were dressed in white German uniforms and consisted of former staffers, sappers, cavalrymen, and bersaglieri. They were very heterogeneous in their composition. They had only recently arrived by train from Italy and were to be used on the supply lines. They unloaded from the train just in time to witness the panic flight of the household troops who had occupied the city since the summer. As a result, they went straight from the train to the front, where they were sent by their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Manari. The latter was an undoubtedly talented commander of considerable valour from the 3rd Bersaglieri Regiment. Unfortunately, he was killed in the first bombardment, and his place was taken by an infantry major. At first, these troops were continually replenished by volunteers. But soon all or practically all the black shirts from Montebello and Tagliamento who were not wounded or frostbitten were on the front lines, and the flow of volunteers dried up. Subsequently, companies, or rather centime, were formed mixed units that included infantrymen, artillerymen, sappers, and other specialties. They also had to be sent to the front line and also wore German uniforms, but they were mostly random people who not only had no fighting spirit, but even did not feel confident in their abilities, so they were of little use in battle. Most often they were used on auxiliary operations. During the existence of the Italian garrison in Chertkov, its number fluctuated from 500 to 700 people. It was said that there were about 4,000 Germans there. In my opinion, they were much more there. All their units were fully manned and ready for battle. The command was carried out by a colonel, who was called the genius of fortification. Even a lieutenant colonel, who led our column from the Don to Chertkovo, was subordinate to him. The main German headquarters was located in the basement of an imposing stone building in the German sector of the city. They also had headquarters for individual military units, also hidden deep underground. Later, I had the opportunity to visit one of them. What I saw made a great impression on me. In the Italian headquarters, there was a German liaison officer at all times. Despite having received orders to be on standby, we did not go anywhere. At least not that day. We soon learned why. The Germans had an order from Hitler's headquarters to gain a foothold and hold Chertovo fortress at any cost. That's why they weren't going to give us tanks to escort us. Without tanks, we could not pass 60 kilometers separating us from theirs. Even one Russian tank would have been enough to finish us off. From then on, talk of leaving the city stopped. We were to be liberated by the troops, who seemed to be on their way somewhere. Of course, this prospect was not very cheerful, because every day we lost people who died under enemy bombs, and only one thing was comforting. It was possible not to leave our numerous wounded and frostbitten in a German-occupied village, which was being approached by the Red Army from all sides. Meanwhile, the Russians received reinforcements and the ring around the city closed. We found ourselves completely surrounded. Everyone adapted to the new situation as best they could. Some new soldiers were constantly coming into our house, then they disappeared and others took their place. Eventually the turnover stopped. The permanent contingent consisted of 6 officers and 24 soldiers. Apart from Candela and Giudici, a junior lieutenant in Torino's 82nd Infantry Regiment, who were somewhat older, the other officers all, as one, appeared to be born in 1921, that is, aged 21. Among us appeared Valorzi, a native of Roverto, who was also in the 82nd Infantry Regiment. Copti, a Sicilian from the 8th Artillery Regiment of Pasubio, and his friend Milanese Balestra, a student at the military academy. I still have the deepest respect for these officers. I will never forget how much effort Conti made in persuading Balestra to go to the infirmary to have his back wound treated. Balestra did not want to hear it. He claimed that his wound was minor and did not want to waste scarce medicines and dressings on him, which were already in short supply for countless seriously wounded men. There were some very different people, but they did not stay in our company. I remember one extremely unpleasant lieutenant. He belonged to those disgusting, completely immoral individuals who will always find a way to get a warm place closer to the bosses. Always grovelling before his commanders, he had the typical mentality of a rear rat. He kept his distance from us, his peers, even withholding the little information he learned through his work at General X's headquarters. His soldiers told us that in the summer he made a Russian girl his mistress. When he thought of getting rid of her, he did not wisely declare her a spy and brought her to the firing squad. At first, this vile person attempted to drive us out of the house. We often had to watch Contier, the most nervous and sensitive of us, argue heatedly with him. In spite of his good relations with General X, this subject was never able to deal with us. Nor was he able to find common ground with us, since we all stood for each other. When he realized he couldn't deal with us, he quietly disappeared, taking a few of his men with him. After the safe departure of the strangers, an atmosphere of friendship and mutual understanding prevailed in our house. The room where we used to put the garbage was now cleaned and occupied by the newly arrived soldiers. We were constantly heating 2 stoves, so the rooms were warm. We no longer had to gnash our teeth against the cold at dawn, because someone would get up and start a fire. Fences, poles, logs from ruined houses and the like were used for fuel. Every day we went in search of firewood and dragged everything in sight into the house.